The sky turned green at 4:47 in the afternoon. Ruth Calloway saw it from the front porch, and her coffee mug slipped from her fingers before she could think to hold on. It hit the worn boards and shattered brown liquid, spreading across wood that had been bleached gray by 40 Oklahoma summers. But she didn't look down. She couldn't. Her eyes were locked on that color bleeding across the western horizon, that particular shade of sick yellow-green that had no business being in any sky over any decent piece of earth. She knew that color the way she knew the sound of her own heartbeat. It had killed her husband. 22 years ago, that same poison light had painted the sky over this same stretch of land, over these same 60 acres of Oklahoma red clay and winter grass, and Frank Calloway had pushed her down the cellar steps with the hands that had held her for 30 years of marriage. He'd shoved her down into the dark, and then he'd turned back to close the doors because that was the kind of man Frank was. He didn't leave things undone. He didn't leave doors open when danger was coming. The tornado took him before he could get down the steps. Ruth had listened to her husband die. She'd heard the roar of the wind swallow whatever sound he made. She'd felt the cellar doors buckle inward, straining against forces that no structure built by human hands was ever meant to withstand. The concrete walls had shaken around her like the walls of a living thing in its final moments. Dust had fallen from the ceiling. The single bare bulb had flickered twice, then died, and she'd spent the next 4 minutes in absolute darkness listening to the end of the world overhead. When silence finally came, when she climbed those steps and put her shoulder to those warped steel doors and pushed them open into the gray aftermath, Frank was gone. Not dead, not lying somewhere nearby where she might find him and hold him. Gone. The tornado had carried him away like he was nothing. Like 30 years of marriage and 100,000 ordinary mornings over coffee and a laugh that could fill any room in any house were nothing at all. They found his body 2 miles east, caught in the branches of a white oak that had stood on the Morrison property for 110 years. The tree had survived everything. 2 world wars, the Dust Bowl, the oil busts, and the farm crises, and every storm that Oklahoma had thrown at that particular corner of the county. It had survived all of that. It just hadn't survived the same day as Frank Calloway. Now that green was back. The emergency sirens started up from the water tower at the edge of Hennessy 3 miles south. Ruth counted the seconds between each wail out of habit. 22 years of living alone on 60 acres had made her a counter. She counted seconds between lightning and thunder. She counted dollars between paydays that no longer came. She counted the days between phone calls from people who remembered she existed, and there were times when that count ran past 30 without interruption. Her phone buzzed in the pocket of her house dress. She didn't need to look at it. EF4, Creek County, seek shelter immediately. Ruth Calloway was 67 years old. She stood 5 feet 4 inches in her work boots, and she weighed 118 pounds after a full meal, which this had not been. She had spent 35 years as an emergency room nurse at Creek County General, working double shifts and night rotations, in the kind of hours that turn ordinary human beings into something harder and stranger than what they started out as. She had held dying children in her arms. She had told mothers that their sons weren't coming home. She had watched men bleed out on gurneys while she worked with steady hands and a voice that never shook, not once, not in 35 years. She had seen things that would break most people. Nothing scared her anymore. Nothing except that green sky. The wind hit 40 miles an hour, then 50. Her gray hair whipped across her face and stung her eyes. The old farmhouse groaned behind her, boards and beams creaking like the bones of something very old trying and failing to hold itself upright. The oak tree in the side yard, the one where Frank had proposed to her 51 years ago, was bending at an angle that made her stomach drop. She should go inside. She should get down to the cellar right now and pull those steel doors shut over her head and wait for whatever was coming to pass over her. She was still standing on the porch when she saw the headlights. They came through the rain on Route 44 like a line of fire moving fast, dozens of them cutting through the gray curtain of the approaching storm. The formation was struggling. She could see it even from 200 yards, could see the bikes being pushed sideways by the gusting wind, could see riders fighting their handlebars, leaning hard into crosswinds that had no right being that strong this far from the funnel. One bike wobbled dangerously, nearly laying down before the rider caught it. Another pulled off the road entirely, the man's boots hitting the mud as he wrestled his machine back from the ditch. Motorcycles, a lot of them. Ruth squinted through the rain. The wind was howling now, a steady freight train sound that she could feel in her back teeth. The sky to the west had gone from green to brown to an almost complete darkness, the kind that didn't belong to any time of day, the kind that meant the funnel had dropped and was moving, and everything in its path was about to stop existing. Those riders had maybe 4 minutes. 4 minutes to find cover, or they were going to die on Route 44 in front of her property, and Ruth was going to stand on her porch and watch it happen. The first bike slid into her gravel driveway. The rider was enormous black leather jacket, dark with rain, face hidden behind a soaked bandana pulled up over the bridge of his nose. He killed the engine and stood there for a moment, turning in a slow circle, scanning the property for anything that might save his life. More bikes followed. 10, 20, 40. Ruth's stomach clenched. She could see their patches now, even through the rain, even at this distance. The death's head grinning from the backs of leather vests. The letters stitched in red and white that she recognized the same way any person who'd lived 67 years in rural Oklahoma would recognize them. Hell's Riders. Every story she'd ever heard about that club, every news segment, every hushed conversation at the grocery store, every time she'd seen a sheriff's deputy reach for his radio, when a group of them rolled through town, it all landed on her at once. Every instinct she had told her to get off the porch. Lock the door, get to the cellar, wait for the storm to pass, and pray those men moved on before she had to deal with them. Then a bike went down. The rider hit the asphalt hard, his machine sliding out from underneath him, in a shower of orange sparks, the metal screaming against the wet road. Two men jumped off their bikes before the sound had finished echoing and ran to him, grabbing his arms, pulling him up from the gravel. But something was wrong with how he was moving. His right arm hung at an angle that arms don't hang at when everything inside them is still in its proper place. Behind the tree line to the west, Ruth saw the funnel drop. She had seen tornadoes before. She had lived through 3 of them on this property over 67 years, had heard the stories of a dozen more from people who'd survived them or hadn't. But the thing that descended from that brown-green sky was different from anything she had seen or heard described. It was enormous. A churning column of destruction that stretched from the cloud base to the red clay earth, like something that had decided the space between sky and ground should simply not exist anymore. It moved the way very large, dangerous things move, with a kind of slow inevitability that makes the brain refuse to process the speed until it's already too late. 2 miles out, maybe less. 4 minutes had become 2. Ruth was off the porch before she understood she was moving. Her boots hit the mud. The rain came at her sideways, driven by wind that was trying to push her back toward the house, trying to keep her where she belonged, safe and small, and out of the way of what was coming. She ran toward the bikes, toward the men in the leather vests, toward 79 people who had maybe 90 seconds to find shelter or die in her driveway. She must have looked insane. The lead rider turned and saw her coming. Even through the rain and the wind and the noise of the approaching storm, she could see the confusion on his face, the absolute disbelief of a man who had seen a great many unexpected things in his life and had just been presented with something that didn't fit any category he'd ever developed. An old woman in a house dress, soaked to the bone, running toward him across a muddy field with an EF4 tornado 2 miles back. She stopped 2 feet in front of him. The wind was a living thing between them, pushing and shoving, trying to knock her sideways. She planted her feet in the mud and looked up at him. He was at least 6'2", maybe 6'3", and 30 pounds heavier than her husband had been at his heaviest, with a gray beard plastered to his jaw by the rain, and eyes the color of the Cimarron River in January. Cold eyes, eyes that had seen violence and caused violence, and made no particular apology for either. He looked at her like she was something he didn't know how to classify. "There's a cellar," she said, loud enough to cut through the wind. "Under my barn, reinforced concrete. It survived 2 tornadoes. You get down there right now and you'll live. You stay on that road and you won't." The man stared at her. "Lady," he said, "do you know who we are?" Ruth took one more step toward him. She could hear the tornado now. That sound she had never been able to describe adequately to anyone who hadn't heard it. That sound that isn't quite wind and isn't quite thunder, but is something older than both, something that speaks directly to every animal instinct the human body still carries from the days before houses and cities, and the comfortable illusion that the natural world could be reasoned with. I know you're about to be dead if you don't move right now. That tornado is less than 2 minutes out. She pointed toward the barn. Move. He stared at her for 3 full seconds. She counted them. Then something shifted in those river stone eyes. Something she recognized, though she hadn't expected to find it here in a man like this, in a moment like this. It was the same thing she'd seen in trauma patients who'd been fighting the pain so long, they'd forgotten there was another option. The moment when they finally let someone else take the wheel. You heard her. His voice came out like something forged rather than spoken, deep and certain and carrying across the rain and wind without effort. He didn't shout it. He didn't need to. Off the bikes. Follow her. Go now. 79 men abandoned their machines. 79 members of the Hell's Riders left their motorcycles in the mud and the rain and turned to follow an old woman in a house dress toward a barn that was shaking hard enough to be visible from 30 yards away. Ruth ran. She ran hard the way she hadn't run since she was 50 years younger, her lungs burning and her legs aching, and every joint in her body registering a protest she didn't have time to acknowledge. Behind her, she could hear them, the sound of 79 pairs of boots hitting mud and gravel, the sound of men who had probably never followed anyone they didn't choose to follow, now choosing to follow her. The barn doors were stuck. Of course they were stuck. 22 years of neglect in Oklahoma weather had warped the wood and rusted the hinges into something that required more than one 67-year-old woman to move. She grabbed the handle and pulled, and nothing happened. Then a hand appeared beside hers. Then two more. Three men in leather vests, their combined weight and strength thrown against the doors, muscles straining against fabric soaked dark with rain. They pulled together. The hinges screamed. The wood groaned and shuddered, and then gave way all at once, the doors swinging open so fast that two of the men stumbled forward. Inside the cellar entrance waited, concrete steps leading down into darkness. The same steps Frank had pushed her down 22 years ago, the last thing he ever did for her. The same darkness that had saved her life while the tornado took her husband. Down, Ruth said. Everyone down, single file move. She positioned herself at the top of the stairs and counted heads as they poured past her into the dark. 10, 20, 30. The man with the injured arm was being half carried by two others, his face the color of old ash, his right forearm bent at that wrong angle that told her the radius and ulna had both let go. He was in shock. He needed a hospital. What he was getting was a concrete cellar in a barn that was shaking hard enough to knock dust from the rafters. 40, 50, 60. The wind had become something beyond wind. It grabbed at her dress and tried to pull her off her feet, and she locked her knees and kept counting because someone had to, because these men were trusting her with their lives the same way patients had trusted her for 35 years, and she had never lost count of a patient yet. 70, 75. That's everyone, the leader called out. He was the last one still above ground, standing at the barn entrance, with rain driving sideways around him. Get in! Ruth looked west one final time. The tornado filled half the sky. It wasn't a column anymore. It was a wall, a moving wall of brown and black that was consuming everything in its path, trees and fence posts and the grain bin that had stood on the Hendricks property for 40 years, all disappearing into it without ceremony. The sound was beyond description. It was the sound of the world being undone. She went down the stairs. The leader came down behind her and grabbed the cellar door handles and pulled them shut above his head, and Ruth heard his tendons straining against the force trying to tear those doors off their hinges from the outside, and then the doors clanged shut and the latch caught, and there was a single heartbeat of complete stillness. Then the tornado arrived. The noise hit first, not sound the way sound normally works, passing through air and into ears and being processed by a brain at some comfortable remove. This was vibration. This was pressure. This was something that bypassed the ears entirely and set every bone in her body resonating at a frequency she didn't have a name for. The concrete walls shook. Dust cascaded from the ceiling in a continuous gray rain. The single bare bulb that hung from the ceiling on a black wire flickered once, twice, and went dark. Someone was praying. Someone else was crying. Near the back wall, she could hear a young man hyperventilating, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps that weren't doing him any good. Ruth clicked on her flashlight. 79 faces emerged from the darkness. Tattooed and bearded and hard faces that had stared down police officers and rival clubs and men who wanted them dead, faces that had never flinched in bar fights or backroad confrontations, or the kind of midnight trouble that ordinary people only heard about secondhand. These were men who had built their entire identities around the idea that they were afraid of nothing. Their eyes told a different story. Everyone listened. Her voice came out the same way it had come out in the ER for 35 years, calm and clear, and carrying an authority that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with absolute certainty. 78 heads turned toward her flashlight beam. This cellar survived two tornadoes, 1987 and 2003. Both of them were rated higher than what's passing over us right now. These walls are 18 inches of reinforced concrete. The doors are steel-plated. We are going to be fine. Near the back of the crowd, she heard a short, nervous laugh. Young. The voice that went with it was younger still. How do you know it's weaker than those other ones? Ruth moved her flashlight until she found the speaker. A young man, 22 at the outside, pressed against the back wall with his hands balled into fists at his sides and his eyes showing white around the edges. His chest was heaving. Because I'm still alive to tell you about them, she said, and I was standing in this same spot both times. She didn't wait for a response. She moved through the crowd, stepping around and between men twice her size until she reached the injured man propped against the far wall. His name, she would learn later, was Hayes. Right now, he was a compound fracture of the radius and ulna with associated soft tissue damage, an early-stage hemorrhagic shock, and none of those things were going to improve on their own. She crouched beside him. "What's your name, Hayes?" The word came out through gritted teeth. "Okay, Hayes, I'm Ruth. I was an ER nurse for 35 years. I'm going to set that arm. It's going to hurt. You need something to bite down on." The leader materialized beside her. He didn't ask questions. He reached into his vest and pulled out a thick leather wallet and handed it to Hayes without a word. Hayes shoved it between his teeth. His eyes found Ruth's, and she held his gaze steady and set on 3, because she had learned long ago that the anticipation was half the battle, and the kindest thing you could do was shorten it. She pulled on 2. Hayes's whole body convulsed. His back arched off the wall. 2 men grabbed his shoulders without being asked and held him in place while Ruth worked her fingers, finding the broken ends of the bones through torn skin and damaged tissue, manipulating them back towards something that would hold until a surgeon could do the rest. The sound the bones made was not a sound she had ever gotten used to, even after 3 decades of procedures she'd rather not think about. But her hands didn't shake. They never shook. "Done," she said, and reached for the emergency kit she'd kept in this cellar for 22 years, because 22 years of Oklahoma tornado seasons had taught her that hope and preparation were not mutually exclusive. She cleaned the wound. She applied antibiotic ointment from a tube that was 3 years past its printed expiration date and would work anyway. She wrapped the arm tight and straight with a splint fashioned from the wooden slats she'd packed for exactly this reason, and medical tape that had survived 2 floods and a possum infestation and was still holding. "You'll need surgery," she told Hayes when she finished, "but you'll keep the arm. Don't use it. Don't move it. Get to a hospital the moment the storm clears." Hayes nodded. The leather wallet fell from between his teeth. His head lolled back against the concrete as the shock and exhaustion pulled him somewhere quieter. "Someone watch him," Ruth said to no one in particular. "If he stops responding, you find me." She went to find the young man with the panicking lungs. He was still pressed against the back wall, still hyperventilating, still fighting a battle entirely in his own nervous system that had nothing to do with anything in the cellar and everything to do with whatever his mind had decided was going to happen in the next 30 seconds. Up close, he looked even younger. He couldn't have been more than 22. His hands were trembling, and his lips had gone the pale color that preceded fainting. "Name," Ruth said softly. "Connor. Connor Briggs." "Okay, Connor, I need you to look at me." His eyes found hers, wild, lost, drowning. She took his right hand and pressed it against her sternum, flat against the center of her chest. "Feel that? Feel how slow and steady that is. I need you to match it. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Can you do that?" "I can't." His voice cracked. "I can't breathe. We're going to die down here." "No, we're not. We're going to sit here together, you and me, and we're going to breathe. And when that tornado passes, we're going to walk up those stairs and see the sun." She held his gaze without blinking. You don't have to believe me. You just have to breathe. Can you do that? Agonizingly slowly, his breathing began to even out. The death grip on her hand tightened, then relaxed by degrees. The terror in his eyes didn't disappear, but it shifted into something more manageable. Still afraid, but no longer going under. Thank you, he whispered. That's what we do, Ruth said. She squeezed his hand once and stood up. We take care of each other. She moved through the rest of the cellar. Blankets from the shelf for the men who were shaking with cold and adrenaline. Water bottles for the ones whose mouths had gone dry. A word here, a steady look there, the same tools she'd used for 35 years in fluorescent lit rooms full of people who were also in their own ways fighting to stay above water. Not one of the 79 men questioned her authority. Not one challenged her commands or pushed back or made a comment about what an old woman in a house dress was doing giving orders to the Hell's Riders. In this concrete box beneath a tornado, Ruth Calloway was the most qualified person in the room, and every man present understood it without being told. The leader watched her from across the cellar. She could feel his eyes following her as she worked the same measuring look he'd given her out in the rain, that quality of attention that took in information without revealing what it was doing with it. When she finally sat down on an overturned milk crate, her back against the cold wall, he crossed the cellar and sat beside her. His name, he told her, was Colt, president of the Oklahoma chapter. He didn't elaborate on what that meant, as though the weight of it was self-evident, which perhaps it was. You've done this before, he said. Survived a tornado. Taking care of people who are falling apart. She accepted the water bottle someone had pressed into her hands. 35 years in the ER. She took a long drink and felt the cold of it settle her. You see enough trauma, you learn to stay calm when everything's falling apart. Panic kills more people than the injury itself. My job was always to be the calm in the storm. Above them, the tornado continued its assault on the barn and everything above it. The cellar doors buckled inward, with each pulse of pressure straining against the hinges that had been installed by Frank's father back in 1953 and had never been adequately thanked for their service. Why did you quit? Colt asked. My husband died. Her voice was flat. The flatness of something that has been said so many times it has worn smooth. Medical bills took everything. The farm was the only thing left. She didn't say more. She had learned that people who asked about Frank usually wanted a story, a narrative with emotional beats they could follow. Colt didn't seem to want that. He asked because he wanted information, and when he had it, he held it quietly. Why did you help us? He said instead. The truth. Ruth stared at the concrete floor. The vibration of the tornado was something she could feel in her molars, in the bones of her feet, through the soles of her boots. The storm was directly overhead. If these walls were going to fail, they had about 60 seconds to make that decision. Because I watched my husband die trying to save me, she said. He put me in this cellar and turned back to close the doors, and the tornado took him before he got down the stairs. I spent 22 years asking myself what I could have done differently. She looked at Colt. Those January river eyes were not as cold as they had seemed out in the rain. Tonight I saw your people out there struggling, and I had a cellar. If I locked my door and hid, if I let 79 people die because I was afraid I'd become someone who let fear win, I become the person Frank died protecting. Colt was quiet for a moment. Most people would have locked that door, he said. I'm not most people. No. Something in his voice softened. You're not. The silence came like a switch being thrown. One moment the world was ending and the next there was nothing. No roar, no pressure, no shaking walls or straining doors. Just the sound of 79 men breathing in the dark. Ruth stood up slowly. Every joint in her body registered the effort. She was 67 years old and she had just sprinted across a muddy field and performed a field reduction on a compound fracture and talked a panicking young man back from the edge and provided emergency care to 79 people in a concrete box, and she was tired in a way that went all the way down to the cellular level. Stay here, she said. I'll check outside first. Like hell. Colt rose beside him. We go together. They climbed the stairs. Colt put his shoulder to the doors, and they groaned and resisted and finally gave way. Ruth stepped out of the cellar into the gray light of early morning. The storm had passed while they weren't looking. The sky to the east held the first pale suggestion of dawn. She looked at her property, and her heart simply stopped. Her farmhouse was gone. Not damaged, not broken, gone. The foundation was there, covered in debris, but the walls and the roof and everything she had accumulated in 40 years of living in that house, the furniture Frank had built with his own hands, the curtains her mother had sewn, the photographs on every wall, Danny's room with his trophies still on the shelf, then the kitchen where she had made 10,000 meals and drunk 10,000 cups of coffee and lived what had felt like a complete life. All of it had been reduced to scattered wreckage, spread across the property in every direction. She couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't make her mind process what her eyes were showing her. Colt caught her before her legs gave out. His hands were steady and his grip was firm without being rough, and she leaned against him for a moment because she had no choice. Because there are things the body simply refuses to stand up straight in the face of, and the total erasure of 40 years of living is one of them. My house, her voice cracked in the middle of the word. Everything I own. She pulled away from him and walked toward the ruin. Her boots crunched on broken glass and splintered wood, and what she eventually recognized as a fragment of her grandmother's china, the blue pattern set that had survived 4 generations and been carried across 2 state lines and had now been reduced to a piece the size of her palm. She found the photograph near what used to be the living room wall. Water damaged the corners bent, but the image still clear. Frank and Danny, 30 years ago. Her husband with his arm around their son. Both of them smiling at the camera, both of them alive, both of them looking at whoever held the camera with a kind of uncomplicated joy that made the loss of them a physical sensation in her chest. She fell to her knees and picked it up with hands that she would not allow to shake. My son. She clutched the photograph to her chest. This is all I have left of him. Colt approached slowly. She could feel him behind her. What happened to him? She kept her eyes on the photograph. Afghanistan, 20 years ago, an IED. They said it was random. Wrong place, wrong time. Colt didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, I'm sorry, he was a good boy. She traced Danny's face with one finger, the familiar lines of him, the way he'd looked at 25 frozen there forever. All he ever wanted to do was protect people. That's why he enlisted. That's why she stopped. Because Colt was staring at the photograph. His face had changed. Some color had drained out of it. His jaw had tightened and his eyes had gone to a different place, some interior calculation happening behind them that she could see without being able to read. What she asked, he looked away, then back at the photograph, then at her face. It's nothing. His voice was careful in a way it hadn't been before. He looks familiar. That's all. Ruth studied him. Familiar how? I don't know. Forget it. She kept looking at him. Colt was a man who chose his words and chose his expressions and maintained control of both as a matter of professional necessity. She had spent 35 years reading the faces of people in the worst moments of their lives. People who were hiding pain or fear or information from her, and she could see it as clearly as she could see the dawn coming up behind him. You knew him, the denial formed on his lips. She watched it form. You knew my son. He stood very still. The ruined property stretched around them in every direction. The debris field of her life, the wreckage of 40 years, scattered across 60 acres of red clay. 78 men were emerging from the cellar behind them, blinking in the gray morning light, taking in the destruction, with expressions that moved from relief to something closer to awe. Colt looked at her for a long moment. Then he told her the truth, or the beginning of it. I can't be sure, he said. I need to make some calls. I need to verify some things before I say anything. Verify what, Mabel? Ruth? He caught himself started over. Ruth, if I'm right about this, you deserve to hear it completely. Not pieces, not guesses. The full truth verified. What truth? What are you talking about? 5 days. His voice was firm, without being unkind. Give me 5 days. I'll come back and I'll tell you everything. Why can't you tell me now? Because if I'm right, it changes everything you think you know about the last 20 years of your life. He held her gaze. And you've already lost enough today. You deserve to hear this properly. Ruth wanted to grab him by the front of his vest and demand every word he was holding back. She was 67 years old, and her house was gone, and she was kneeling in the mud with her dead son's photograph, and a man she'd known for 4 hours was telling her there was something about Danny she didn't know, and the combination of all of that was almost more than she could carry. But she was tired. so tired that the anger didn't have anywhere to go. 5 days, she said. 5 days, Colt confirmed. He reached into his vest and produced a plain card. Just a number, no name, no address. If you need anything before then, he said. Anything at all. Ruth took the card. Her fingers brushed against his, and she felt the calluses and the old scars, the hands of a man who had worked hard and fought harder, and was now choosing in this particular moment to be gentle. Why are you doing this? She asked. Because you saved 79 of my people tonight. He said it simply without embellishment. And because I might owe you more than that. He didn't explain what he meant. He turned and walked back toward the cellar, toward the 78 men who were standing in the debris field of her former home, looking at the destruction, the way men look at things they want to do something about and can't, not yet. Mount up, his voice carried across the property with the same unforced authority it always carried. Those whose bikes survived, double up the rest. We're heading out. The Hell's Riders moved with the kind of efficiency that comes from years of operating together. Bikes retrieved from the driveway. Men redistributed engines starting one by one in the gray morning air. The sound of them built slowly, dozens of machines finding their voices in the aftermath of the storm. Colt was the last to leave. He mounted his bike, a big black Harley with enough road dust on it to tell a story of its own, and he looked back at Ruth still kneeling in the ruins of her home with the photograph pressed to her chest. 5 days, he said. Then he kicked the bike to life and led his people down Route 44, away from the destruction, away from the woman who had saved them, and the sound of them faded slowly until there was nothing left but the wind moving through the debris and the distant call of a meadowlark somewhere in the field to the north, as though the world intended to go on regardless. Ruth stayed where she was for a long time. The sun came up over the eastern horizon and threw long shadows across the wreckage of her property. It was a beautiful morning, clear and gold and utterly indifferent to what had happened here in the dark. She looked at the photograph in her hands, at Frank and Danny smiling at her from 30 years ago, from a world that no longer existed in any physical sense. What didn't you tell me? She whispered to her son's face. What did you take with you when you went? The photograph didn't answer. But somewhere in the deep, reliable part of her, the part that had kept her functioning through 35 years of emergency medicine and the death of her husband and the death of her son and 22 years of solitude on 60 acres of Oklahoma red clay, she knew that whatever Colt was carrying was big enough to change the shape of everything. 5 days. She had no idea how right she was. The first day passed in the particular haze that follows catastrophic loss, that state, where the mind simply refuses to process at full speed and moves instead through a kind of gray cotton, picking things up and setting them down, making small decisions because large ones are temporarily beyond reach. Ruth wandered through the debris of her farmhouse, lifting fragments and examining them and placing them in a pile that had no real purpose other than giving her hands something to do. A broken picture frame with the glass still intact, a water-stained Bible that had belonged to Frank's mother, the handle of Frank's favorite coffee mug, white ceramic, with the Creek County Feed and Supply logo on it, the mug he'd drunk from every morning for 15 years, and that she'd kept on the shelf after he died, because some objects become too significant to put away. She found what was left of her wedding dress near a fence post 100 yards from where the closet used to be. The white fabric was torn and mud-stained, wrapped around the post, as though the tornado had been trying to make a point. She pulled it free and held it against her chest for a while, standing in the field with the dress in her arms and the morning sun on her face. She slept in her car that night. The back seat was cramped and the vinyl was sticky, and her neck kinked at an angle that would take a week to recover from. But she couldn't leave Siam. The land was all she had left now. The land and the photograph and the card with the phone number and the questions she couldn't stop asking. What didn't you tell me, Danny? The second day brought Earl Morrison. He was 73 years old and had farmed the property to the east for 40 years and knew Ruth the way that people who live adjacent to each other for decades come to know each other thoroughly and practically and without much sentimentality. He drove over in his pickup at 7 in the morning and stood at the edge of the debris field with his hands in his pockets and looked at everything without saying anything for a while. Then he said, Mabel, you can't stay out here. It's Ruth Earl. You've been Ruth since you married Frank, and I still say Mabel because that's who you were when I first met you. His voice was unhurried. Come stay with me and Linda. Spare room, real bed, hot meals. I'm not leaving this land. He looked at her steadily. He had known her long enough to recognize the set of her jaw. At least let me bring you a tent, he said. He came back 2 hours later with a camping tent and a cooler full of food and a portable generator. He helped her set up in the clearing beside the ruined barn, working without asking questions about the motorcycles or the skid marks in her gravel driveway or the 79 tire tracks leading in and out of her property. That was Earl's way. He helped. He didn't require explanations in exchange. You're stubborn as all creation, he said when he finished. That's how I survived this long. He drove away and Ruth sat in front of her tent and watched the sun go down over the ruins of her property. The sky turned orange and pink, and then the particular shade of deep purple that Oklahoma evenings do better than anywhere else she'd ever seen. Beautiful light on a ruined landscape. She held the photograph in her prep and looked at Danny's face and thought about what Colt had said. He looks familiar. What did that mean? Danny had deployed 3 times. He'd been stationed in places Ruth couldn't find on a map without help. He'd known people she'd never met, lived a life that existed mostly in the letters and phone calls that had kept her connected to him across 12 time zones, in a war she didn't fully understand. Had he known Colt? Had he known the Hells Riders? The questions circled without landing anywhere useful. On the third day, a black car appeared at the edge of her property. The man who stepped out of it was wearing an expensive suit in a color between gray and blue that probably had a name she didn't know, and he picked his way across the debris-strewn ground toward her with the careful steps of someone whose shoes cost more than her car. Mrs. Calloway. His voice was practiced and pleasant, the voice of a man who had made a study of seeming reasonable. My name is Warren Digby, Creek County Development Association. He extended his hand. She didn't take it. I wanted to speak with you about your property. He continued without losing the pleasant tone, as though her failure to shake his hand was simply a cultural difference he was graciously accommodating. As you may be aware, there's been significant development interest in this area for some time. Your situation has accelerated those conversations. 60 acres in this location is extremely valuable. I'm not selling. You haven't heard the offer. I don't need to. Ruth kept her voice even. This land belonged to my father. It was my husband's. My son's memorial is here. My husband is buried on this property. I'm not selling it to build a shopping center. Digby's pleasant expression didn't waver, but something behind it went flat. Mrs. Calloway, I understand the sentimental dimension, but surely you can see that rebuilding here is impractical. You're 67 years old with no house, no income, and no insurance. I'm offering you a genuine way out of an untenable situation. Ruth stood up. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 118 pounds, and she had nothing, not a house or a bank account or a family member within 100 miles. But she had 35 years of experience making doctors and surgeons and hospital administrators back down, and she brought all of it to bear on Warren Digby right now. Mr. Digby, she said quietly, I've survived 3 tornadoes. I've buried my husband and my son. I've spent the last 22 years alone on this land, working it with my own 2 hands. You think because my house is gone that I'm going to sign away everything I've ever known because some development company wants to put up a strip mall? She pointed toward his car. Get off my property and don't come back. Digby held his position for a moment that was slightly too long to be comfortable. You'll reconsider, he said, when the reality of your situation becomes clearer. The reality of my situation, Ruth had said, is that I know where Frank kept his shotgun, and I have a very good idea which pile of debris it's under. She met his eyes. Have a good day, Mr. Digby. He left. She watched his car until it turned onto Route 44 and disappeared. Then she looked down at the card in her pocket, the one with the phone number and no name. 4 days left. She could wait 4 days. On the 4th day, her phone rang with an unknown Oklahoma number, and she answered it before it finished the first ring. Ruth, it's Colt. She gripped the phone hard enough to feel the case flex. What did you find? I need to see you in person. Tell me now. This isn't the kind of thing that gets said over the phone. I don't care. Tell me. The pause that followed was long enough that she could hear him breathing. She waited. She had gotten very good at waiting. Did Danny ever mention a club? He said finally. The ground shifted under her feet. What kind of club? You know what kind, Ruth. No, her voice came out barely above a whisper. No, I don't know what kind. Tell me what kind. Another long pause. When he spoke again, every word was measured, chosen with the care of a man who understood that what he was saying couldn't be unsaid. I'm coming tomorrow, a day early. I'm bringing some people with me. People who knew your son. Knew him how I'll explain everything in person. I promise you'll understand it all tomorrow. She wanted to keep pressing. She wanted to refuse to end the call until he told her everything he was holding back. But something in his voice stopped her, some quality of weight and responsibility, the voice of a man who was taking seriously the obligation of telling her something true. Tomorrow, she said. Tomorrow, he confirmed. The line went dead. Ruth sat in her camping chair outside her tent and looked at the phone in her hand, and then at the ruins of her farmhouse, and then at the sky, which was clear and star-filled and enormous in the way that Oklahoma skies are enormous when there are no walls or roofs to contain your sense of them. She did not sleep. She sat in the chair wrapped in a blanket and watched the stars move across the sky and thought about her son. She thought about the Danny she had known, the quiet, thoughtful boy who'd caught fireflies in mason jars on summer evenings, and read too late with a flashlight under his covers, and once stayed up all night to sit with a stray dog that had appeared on their porch with a broken leg, just sat there with it so it wouldn't be alone. She thought about the Danny who had gone to college and then stopped answering questions about it, clearly who had enlisted at 21 with a conviction that made her proud even as it terrified her, who had deployed 3 times and come back each time a little quieter, a little more contained, and who had died on his 3rd deployment in a place she couldn't visit in a way she would never fully understand. What club, Danny? The stars didn't answer, but the answer was coming. And somewhere in the part of her that had survived everything, the part of her that had held dying strangers through their worst moments and walked out the other side, she understood that the answer was going to be the kind that rearranges everything you thought you knew. She watched the horizon begin to lighten in the east. When the first gray light of dawn touched the ruined chimney of her farmhouse, she heard it. A distant rumble, faint at first, easily mistaken for something else. But she had grown up in tornado country, and she knew the difference between natural sounds and mechanical ones, and this was mechanical, and it was growing. Ruth stood up from her camping chair. Her joints protested every inch of the movement. She walked to the edge of her property and looked down Route 44. The road was full of motorcycles. They stretched from horizon to horizon as far as she could see in both directions. Black leather and chrome, and the low morning light catching the surfaces of hundreds of machines moving in formation. The sound of them had become something physical, a vibration she could feel through the soles of her boots, through the red clay of the property that had belonged to her family for 3 generations. She stood very still, and she counted. 50, 100, 200. They kept coming. Colt was at the front. He pulled onto her property and dismounted and walked toward her with the same unhurried deliberateness that characterized everything he did, and behind him the road continued to empty itself of riders, bike after bike pulling onto her land and parking wherever they could find space in the fields, along the fence line in rows across the grass. His face when he reached her was serious in a way that was different from his ordinary seriousness. There was something else in it, something she might have called reverence, if that hadn't seemed like such an unlikely word to apply to a man like Colt. How many, she asked. He stopped in front of her. The morning light was coming up behind her, and she could see his expression clearly, and what she saw in it made her chest tighten before she had any information to tighten it about. 312, he said, from 18 chapters across the country. Ruth looked out at the field full of motorcycles, at the leather vests and the gray beards and the chrome and the dust of long roads on every machine, at the faces of men who had ridden from every corner of the country to stand on a piece of ruined Oklahoma property at dawn. Why, her voice had gone quiet. Colt met her eyes, and for the first time since she had known him, which was not very long but felt in some ways like considerably longer, she saw something in his face that looked like it might be the beginning of tears. Because we owe you a debt, he said, and it's past time to pay it. 2 older men separated from the crowd and walked toward her. The first was in his early 60s, white-bearded, with a pronounced limp in his left leg that he carried without apology, the way men carry old injuries when they have decided the injury is simply part of them now. His eyes were kind in the particular way that belongs to people who have seen a great deal of suffering and have not let it make them hard. The second was younger, maybe 52, with a scar running from his left cheekbone to the corner of his jaw, the kind of scar that doesn't come from accidents. He moved with the contained stillness of a man who had learned to take up exactly as much space as he needed and no more. Colt introduced them without ceremony. Preacher, he said, indicating the older man. Used to be an actual preacher, if you can believe it. And this is Axe. Both men looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. It took her a moment to identify it because she hadn't seen it directed at her in a long time. They looked at her the way people look at someone they already know. They served with, Danny Colt said. Not in the army, in the club. Ruth shook her head before the words had finished reaching her. The motion was involuntary, the body's first defense against information it isn't ready to receive. No, that's not possible. I would have known. He didn't want you to know. Axe's voice was low and rough, the voice of a man who had used it hard for many years. His eyes held something that might have been guilt, or might have been grief, or might have been both living in the same place so long they'd become indistinguishable. He knew you wouldn't approve, so he kept the two parts of his life separate. My son was a soldier. Ruth heard her own voice going tight. He was a good man. He didn't belong to a, he belonged to both. Preacher's voice was gentler than Axe's, gentler than the morning, gentler than she'd expected from a man his size wearing what he was wearing. And he was a good man in both. One didn't cancel out the other. Ruth opened her mouth to say something and found she didn't have anything to say. Preacher reached into his vest and produced a photograph. He held it out to her, and she took it with hands that had stopped being steady without her noticing when that had happened. The photo was old. The colors had faded, and the edges had gone soft with handling the way photographs go when they've been taken out and looked at many times over many years. It showed a group of men standing in front of a row of motorcycles, arms around each other, laughing at something outside the frame. The easy, unself-conscious laughter of people who are genuinely comfortable with each other. In the center of the group, grinning at the camera with an expression she would have recognized anywhere in any context, in any condition, was her son. Danny was wearing a leather vest. On the back of it, clearly visible because he was turned slightly sideways, was the Hell's Rider's death's head. Ruth's knees went out. Colt caught her before she reached the ground. His hands were under her arms, and he lowered her onto the overturned milk crate that someone had placed nearby, as though they had anticipated this moment and prepared for it, and perhaps they had. She stared at the photograph, at Danny's face, at the smile she had known for 25 years, at the vest she had never seen him wear, at the men around him with their arms across his shoulders, the ease of it, the belonging in it, at the secret her son had kept from her for the last 5 years of his life. How long, her voice came out cracked and thin, like something that had been stored too long in the wrong conditions. How long was he one of you? Preacher sat down on a piece of broken fencing nearby. He moved carefully the way men with old knee injuries move when they're paying attention. Danny joined us in 2001, he said. He was 20 years old. His road name was Guardian. Guardian. Ruth turned the word over. It felt wrong and right simultaneously, the way a key feels wrong until it finds its lock. He earned it, Axe said from where he stood at the edge of the group. Your son had a particular gift, finding people who were in trouble and doing something about it. The weak, the lost, the ones who'd fallen through whatever net was supposed to catch them. He'd find them and he'd stay until the situation was handled. Like a guardian, Preacher said quietly. Ruth looked at the photograph again, at Danny's face. She was looking for something she'd missed, some sign that should have told her some detail that would make sense of the gap between the son she'd known and the son she apparently hadn't known at all. This doesn't make sense. She shook her head slowly. In 2001, Danny was in college. He was studying business. He was going to take over the farm. He dropped out, Preacher said, second semester of his sophomore year. He never told you. The words landed like something physical. Ruth thought about that year. Danny had seemed distant when he called. Vague about classes, vague about grades, answering her questions with the kind of careful generality that she'd taken for the normal privacy of a young man establishing his independence. She had respected it. She had given him the space she thought he needed. She had believed every word he'd told her because he was her son and she trusted him completely. Why, she said, why would he join a club and not tell me? Why would he keep this from me for 5 years? Colt, who had been standing slightly back, giving her room, stepped forward now. He exchanged a look with Preacher and Axe. Something passed between the three of them, some silent negotiation about how much to say and in what order. Because we saved his life, Colt said, and he was ashamed of why we had to. Ruth went very still. Preacher leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his weathered hands folded. Danny was in trouble in 2000, he said, his freshman year. He'd gotten involved with a poker game that was bigger than he understood, lost money he didn't have, borrowed more to try to win it back. Classic downward spiral. By the time it caught up with him, he owed $40,000 to people who don't accept apologies as payment. Ruth closed her eyes briefly. She remembered visiting Danny that Christmas. He'd been nervous in a way she hadn't known how to read, flinching at sudden sounds, checking the door of the restaurant 3 times in an hour. She'd asked if everything was all right, and he'd said, "Of course, Mom, everything's fine. Stop worrying." And she had stopped worrying because he'd asked her to. "How did you find him?" she asked. "We heard about a kid who was about to get himself killed," Axe said. "We have people in a lot of places. When we looked into it, we found out Danny was Frank Calloway's son." Colt's jaw tightened slightly. "Your husband had a reputation in certain circles. He helped some of our brothers back in the 80s. Never wore our colors, never joined the club, but he stood by us when it mattered." Frank had never mentioned any of this. But then Frank had kept his own counsel about a great many things, and she was beginning to understand that the men in her life had each maintained entire rooms she'd never been invited into. "We gave Danny a choice," Preacher continued. "He could keep trying to handle it on his own, which was going to end one way, or he could let us handle it and come ride with us for a while, see if it suited him. You paid off $40,000 for a stranger. He wasn't exactly a stranger by then." Colt said it simply. "And we didn't pay the debt." Ruth looked at him sharply. "Let's just say the people Danny owed suddenly decided Oklahoma wasn't a healthy place for their particular line of business," Axe said. His scarred face showed the ghost of something that might have been a smile on a different day. "They relocated. Permanently." She didn't ask for details. She had spent 35 years in emergency medicine, and she had long ago made peace with not asking for details about certain categories of outcome. "So Danny joined because he owed you," she said slowly. "At first," Preacher said, "but that's not why he stayed. He stayed because he found what he'd been looking for." He looked at her with those kind, tired eyes. "Some people find their purpose in church. Some find it in family. Some find it in work. Danny found his riding with us, found men who valued the same things he valued. Brotherhood, showing up for people, doing what needed to be done when nobody else was going to do it. He was the best of us in a lot of ways." Axe said it bluntly without sentiment, which somehow made it more credible than sentiment would have. "Young and stubborn and too brave for his own good. But he had a quality that you can't teach. He genuinely cared. Not as a performance, not because it made him look good. He just actually gave a damn about people who were struggling." Around them, the 312 bikers who had ridden from 18 states were beginning to move with purpose. Trucks were pulling up along the road loaded with lumber and tools and materials. Men in leather vests were unloading supplies, organizing themselves into work crews with the efficiency of people who had done large coordinated projects before and knew how to begin. Ruth watched this without fully processing it, still holding the photograph, still in the first hours of learning that the person she had mourned for 20 years was also someone she had never met. "Why didn't he tell me?" she asked. The question that mattered more than all the others. "Why didn't he just tell me?" The three men looked at each other. "Because he was afraid," Preacher said finally. "Not of you exactly, afraid of disappointing you, afraid you'd see him differently, afraid that if you knew about the gambling, about the debt, about the kind of trouble he'd gotten himself into, you'd love him less. That's..." She stopped. "That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard." "Of course it is," Colt said. "But he was 20 years old and he'd made a significant mess of things, and the person whose opinion mattered most to him in the world was you. People don't always think clearly about the people they love most." Ruth pressed her hand over her eyes for a moment. The photograph crinkled slightly under her fingers, and she loosened her grip carefully. "He should have told me." "Yes." Colt's voice was direct, but not unkind. "He should have. That was his choice, and it was the wrong one, and he knew it. The letter he left makes that clear enough. What letter? Preacher reached into the inner pocket of his vest and produced an envelope. It was old, the paper yellowed at the edges, the flaps sealed, and then carefully unsealed and resealed again at some point in the past. He held it out to her. Danny wrote this before his last deployment, Preacher said. He brought it to our chapter president, a man we called Hawk. Made Hawk swear on his life that the club would see you were taken care of no matter what happened and no matter how long it took. Ruth took the envelope with both hands. She opened it carefully, the way you open something that has been waiting a long time. The paper inside was a single sheet covered in handwriting. She would have known blindfolded Danny's left-leaning scrawl, the letters that always pressed too hard into the page. She read it standing there in the morning light, with 300 men working quietly around her. Mom, if you're reading this, I didn't make it home. She blinked and kept reading. I need you to know some things I should have told you a long time ago. I'm a Hell's Rider. I have been for 5 years. I know that probably surprises you. I know you've heard things about clubs like this, and some of those things are true, but the men I ride with are the best men I've ever known. They stepped in when I was 20 and stupid and about to get myself killed, and they gave me something I didn't know I was missing. A purpose, a family, a reason to keep going that was bigger than just me. She had to stop and breathe. I joined the Army because I wanted to protect people, because I wanted to serve something bigger than myself. But I learned what that meant from my brothers first. They taught me what it means to have someone's back, what it means to be willing to put yourself between danger and the people you love. I kept this secret because I was afraid you'd be disappointed in me. I was afraid you'd find out about the gambling and the debt and the mess I made of things, and I was afraid that would change how you saw me. I know that was wrong. I should have trusted you. You've always been the strongest person I know and the best, and I should have trusted you with this. Here's what matters. I made the brothers promise that if anything happens to me, they'll take care of you. Not just now, not just once, whenever you need them, however long it takes. You're not just my mother, Mom. As far as the club is concerned, you're their mother too. Let them take care of you. That's all I've ever wanted, for you to not be alone. I love you. I'm sorry for what I kept from you. I hope you can forgive me. Your son, Danny. And then in smaller letters at the bottom, almost as an afterthought, road name Guardian. Ask Preacher about it sometime. He'll tell you the story. Ruth read the letter 3 times. Then she leaned against Colt's chest and she cried in a way she hadn't cried since the uniformed men had come to her door 20 years ago. The deep structural crying that comes from somewhere below grief and above despair. The crying of a person who has just learned that the shape of a loss was different from what they thought. She had been grieving the Danny she knew. Now she was grieving the Danny she hadn't known, and also grieving the 20 years she could have had with the club he loved, and also grieving the fact that it had taken a tornado and 79 men in her driveway and 5 days of waiting to bring her to this particular morning. Colt held her without saying anything. Behind her, 300 men stood in silence or worked quietly, giving the moment the space it required. After a while, she pulled back. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and she looked at the men working on the foundation of her ruined farmhouse, and she looked at the photograph still in her hand, and she looked at the letter. He wrote this before he deployed, she said. Why didn't anyone come to me before now? Why did it take this long? Colt's expression shifted into something heavier. Hawk died, he said, 3 months after Danny, motorcycle accident on Highway 44. The letter got lost in the transition. Different president, different priorities, and nobody knew exactly where you'd gone after you left Creek County, General. He met her eyes. We lost the thread, and then you saved 79 of my brothers from a tornado, and one of our archivists recognized your name from the news coverage. He went back through 20 years of records and found the letter. All because I opened my cellar. All because you are who you are, Preacher said. Danny always said you'd give the shirt off your back to a stranger. He was right. Ruth looked at the activity spreading across her property. Men framing walls on the foundation of her old house. Others mixing concrete. A group of younger bikers planting fence posts along the property line with mechanical efficiency. The skeleton of a house was beginning to take shape, bones of fresh lumber rising against the Oklahoma sky. She stood up and walked toward it. "What is this?" she asked. Colt walked beside her. "This is us keeping our promise. 20 years late. I can't let you do this. This must cost. You're not letting us do anything." His voice was patient but firm. Every chapter contributed. We've got men here who are contractors, electricians, plumbers, carpenters, men who build houses for a living. This isn't charity, Ruth. He said her name deliberately. This is family doing what family does. She didn't have words for that. She stood and watched strangers build her a home, and the tears came again quieter this time, and she let them. Throughout the day, different men approached her. They came one or two at a time, introducing themselves, shaking her hand, telling her things about Danny in the careful way that people tell stories about the dead to those who love them, checking her face for signs of how much she could take before continuing. A man called Rusty, 50-something, with a red beard going gray, told her that Danny had talked him off a bridge once. Literally. 3 in the morning, an overpass outside Tulsa, and Danny had appeared as though he'd known, sat down beside him, and stayed until the sun came up and the moment had passed. Never told a soul, Rusty said. Never used it as a story to tell about himself. Just did it and moved on. A man called Bones Younger with close-cropped hair and the build of someone who had once been athletic and hadn't entirely left that behind, told her that Danny was the first person who had welcomed him when he was prospecting. Most guys make you prove yourself before they'll acknowledge you exist, Bones said. Danny just looked at me and said, "Welcome, brother," like it was already decided. Changed the whole tone of how I came up in this club. A third man who gave his name as Wick and had the quiet manner of someone who had spent time in very dark places and come back from most of them, told her that Danny had once said to him, "You're worth more than what you're doing to yourself." Said it once plainly without drama, and then never mentioned it again. Wick said that sentence had stayed with him for 15 years. That it had been the thing he'd come back to on the nights when coming back from anywhere felt like too much effort. Ruth listened to all of it. She wished she had known. She wished she had been there to see the man her son had become in the parts of his life she hadn't witnessed. She understood why he'd kept it from her, understood the fear of it, the particular terror of disappointing the one person whose opinion has always mattered most. But understanding didn't keep her from grieving the version of Danny she might have known if he'd trusted her with the truth. Toward evening, Warren Digby returned. His black car appeared at the edge of the property, and he stepped out looking slightly less composed than he had 2 days ago, his expensive suit jacket missing his collar open. He was carrying a folder of documents. He hadn't taken 3 steps onto the property before Colt was beside Ruth. Axe appeared on her other side. Preacher moved to a position slightly forward between Digby and Ruth with the unhurried certainty of a man who has spent a lifetime knowing where he needs to be. Digby stopped walking. "Mrs. Calloway." His voice had lost some of its practiced pleasantness. He was looking at the 300 men occupying her property and doing the arithmetic that the arithmetic required. "I see you have company. I see you can't take a clear answer," Ruth said. "I came to make a formal offer." He held up the folder. "This is a legal document representing a substantial sum for your property. I think if you look at the numbers." "The lady gave you her answer twice," Colt said. His tone was conversational, almost friendly. The kind of friendly that has nothing warm in it. "This is a business matter." Digby tried to look past Colt toward Ruth. "Mrs. Calloway, please, be reasonable. You're 67 years old with no house, no income, no family. I'm trying to help you." "She has family." Colt took one step forward. 312 of us. Every chapter, every state. You want to make her situation difficult? You're making a lot of men in a lot of places very interested in your business practices. Is that what you want? Digby's folder lowered slightly. "Is that a threat?" "It's geography," Colt said. "We're everywhere you do business." "That's just a fact." Axe cracked his knuckles. Not aggressively, just the way a man cracks his knuckles when he's been working hard and needs to stretch his hands. Digby looked at the folder in his hand. He looked at the 300 men on the property. He looked at Ruth, who was looking back at him with the expression she'd developed across 35 years of emergency medicine for people who were wasting her time in a situation that required clarity. "This isn't over," he said. He was already backing toward his car. "I have resources. I have legal standing." "You can't just—" "Drive carefully, Mr. Digby," Ruth said. His car left faster than it had arrived, gravel spraying from the tires as he turned onto Route 44. Ruth let out a breath. He'll be back, Colt said. I know. She looked at where the frame of her new house was rising against the evening sky. But so will you. He almost smiled. So will we. That night, someone built a fire pit from stones salvaged from the collapsed chimney of her old farmhouse. And the construction work paused as the day ran out of light and men gathered around fires scattered across her property, and the smell of cooking meat drifted through the cool air, and the sound of voices and occasional laughter moved across the land like something the land hadn't heard in a long time. Ruth sat by the main fire and held a cup of coffee and tried to hold all of the day in her mind at once, which was impossible. Some days are too large to be held. You can only sit inside them and wait for them to become memory, which compresses things to a manageable size. Axe sat down beside her without asking permission. He handed her a bottle of water and settled into the camp chair with the careful movements of a man whose body had been through considerable use and was providing ongoing commentary about it. He was quiet for a moment. The fire snapped. Somewhere across the property, someone had produced a guitar and was playing something slow and minor key that suited the evening perfectly. I was with Danny in Afghanistan, Axe said finally. Ruth looked at him. Not the same unit, different squads, but we deployed together and we looked out for each other over there, the same way we looked out for each other here. He stared into the fire. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might have said everything he intended to say. Then he continued. I was there the day he died. The fire crackled. The guitar played on. We were running supplies from FOB Cobra to a village about 20 clicks north. Routine mission. We'd done the route a dozen times. He paused. I remember thinking the approach felt wrong. Narrow road, high ground on both sides. Too many places to be invisible from. I thought about saying something to the convoy commander, and I didn't. What happened? The first RPG hit Danny's vehicle at the front of the column. Direct hit on the engine block. The vehicle was on fire before anyone could react. Axe's hands resting on his knees were very still. He got out. He was burned, I found out later. Burns on his arms and one side of his face. But he got out. And instead of moving to cover, instead of getting low and staying down, he picked up his rifle and started moving toward the enemy positions on the high ground. Ruth closed her eyes. He drew their fire, Axe said. As long as he was moving and shooting, the enemy was focused on him. It gave the rest of us time to dismount and find cover. He held them for 4, maybe 5 minutes. 4 or 5 minutes of one man moving and firing and staying on his feet when he had every reason not to. He swallowed. It saved at least 12 people, maybe more. Ruth pressed her hand over her mouth. He didn't suffer, Axe said, and his voice was careful and deliberate about it, the care of a man who understood that this particular detail mattered more than almost anything else he could offer. It was instant. He didn't suffer. She sat with him that for a while. The fire burned lower. The guitar player transitioned into something even slower. Just chords now, the melody gone. There's something else, Axe said. She looked at him. The ambush was too precise. He said it carefully, like a man who had been thinking about how to say this for a long time. The enemy knew exactly where we'd be, exactly how many vehicles, exactly which road and which choke point. That kind of coordination doesn't come from observation alone. What are you saying? I'm saying someone told them we were coming. Axe's jaw tightened. Someone with access to convoy schedules, patrol routes, logistics. Someone on our side. Ruth went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the Oklahoma evening. After the ambush, I started asking questions. He continued, quietly, carefully talking to people who might have seen or heard something. I had a name within a month. Gerald Pruitt, Sergeant Logistics. He controlled the convoy schedules, knew every route, every timeline, every deviation. Why would he do it? Money, Axe's voice went flat. Pruitt had been running side operations for years, selling equipment, skimming supplies, falsifying inventory reports. Standard corruption that goes undetected when nobody's looking carefully enough. Danny found out. He discovered what Pruitt was doing, and he started collecting evidence, building a case. Ruth's hands had closed into fists in her lap. He confronted Pruitt about a month before the ambush, Axe said. Told him he was going to report everything to command. Pruitt laughed at him, said nobody was going to take a junior soldier's word over a 15-year sergeant's, but Danny didn't back down. Danny never backed down from anything. Axe shook his head. It was his finest quality and the thing that got him killed. 3 weeks later, Pruitt coordinated with his contacts on the other side, gave them the convoy information, the rest you know. You're saying Gerald Pruitt had my son murdered. I'm saying I believe that with every conviction I have. Axe met her eyes directly. I took my suspicions to command immediately after the investigation began. I had circumstantial evidence, names, timelines, but not enough. Not proof. The case went cold within 6 months, and Pruitt was discharged 8 months after Danny died. Where is he now? Axe looked at her for a moment before answering. Gone. Changed his name. Moved around for a few years. Texas, Florida, Arizona. Axe shook his head. I've been looking for him off and on for 20 years. Lost the trail in 2008 and couldn't pick it back up. Ruth stared into the dying fire. 20 years she had believed her son died in a random attack. Wrong place, wrong time, the terrible mathematics of war applied without particular intent to her particular child. She had grieved that. She had made a kind of peace with it, the peace of someone who has accepted that the universe operates without reference to what they deserve. Now she was learning that it hadn't been random, that someone had made a deliberate choice, that Danny had been murdered by a man who then walked away and built himself a new name and a new life somewhere. Thank you, she said, for trying, for not letting it go. Axe looked away. He cleared his throat once. He was my brother, he said. Same club, same country, same damn road. I owed him more than I could give him. He stood up slowly. Get some sleep. Long day tomorrow. He walked away into the darkness between the fires. Ruth sat alone watching the embers. She was still sitting there when Colt found her an hour later. He lowered himself into the chair Axe had vacated and looked at the fire for a while without speaking. That was something she had come to appreciate about Colt in the brief time she'd known him. He didn't fill silence with noise. He understood that silence had its own uses and that waiting was sometimes the most useful thing you could do. Axe told you, he said finally, about Pruitt? Yes, Colt nodded slowly. We've been trying to find that man for 20 years. He pulled out his phone, scrolled through something, and his expression was controlled in a way that suggested effort. Ruth, Gerald Pruitt, became Richard Haynes in 2005. He moved around for a while before settling in Henderson, Nevada. Ruth looked at him. He works at an auto dealership, Colt said. Married, two kids. Nice house in a suburb outside Las Vegas. Living a completely ordinary life. While Danny is buried in a field on this property. While Danny is buried on this property. Colt put the phone away. Yes. Ruth looked at the last of the fire. Orange and red collapsing slowly into gray. I want to find him, she said. Colt was very still. I want to look him in the face, she said. I want him to know that I know. I want to see whether there's any guilt in him at all, any conscience, anything human left. And if there is, I want to watch it destroy him. And if there isn't, then at least I'll know what kind of thing killed my son. She turned to face Colt. This isn't over when Pruitt walks free and my son is 20 years in the ground. She said it quietly without heat, which made it more serious rather than less. Caleb deserved better than that. He found evidence. He built a case. He died because of it. That evidence shouldn't die with him. Ruth, I'm going to Nevada, Colt. She said it the way she'd said everything tonight, without drama, as simple statement of fact. With you or without you, but I'd prefer with you. Colt looked at her for a long time. The firelight moved across his face and she could see him thinking, weighing, calculating the risks and the obligations against each other. You might not get what you're looking for, he said. Pruitt might deny everything. There might be nothing we can do without proof. There might be proof. Ruth reached into the pocket of her jacket and pulled out a small object. A USB drive. Colt's eyes went to it immediately. I found it yesterday, she said. While everyone was working and I was going through what was left of my things, it was in Danny's Bible. She looked at it in her palm. The family Bible that's been passed down 4 generations. The interior was hollowed out. Danny carved it out himself and hid the drive inside. Colt took the drive, carefully turning it over in his hands. Danny came home 3 weeks before his last deployment, Ruth said. He was unusually quiet. Spent a lot of time in his old room. Said he was being nostalgic. She looked at the drive. He was hiding this. He knew he might not come home, and he left something for me. Something he knew I'd eventually find even if it took years. even if it took a tornado to shake it loose from the debris. Preacher appeared from the darkness with a laptop borrowed from one of the younger bikers. He set it up on a piece of lumber that served as a makeshift table, and in the flickering light of the dying fire, surrounded by a handful of men who had ridden from across the country to stand on this piece of ground, Ruth plugged in the drive. For one terrible moment, nothing happened. Then a folder appeared on the screen. Guardian Insurance. Ruth clicked on it. The files spread across the screen in rows. Documents, photographs, audio recordings, spreadsheets with dates and amounts and account numbers. Emails and messages that had been captured and stored with a methodical thoroughness that spoke to someone who understood exactly what they were building and why it needed to be airtight. Preacher made a sound she hadn't heard from him before. Axe leaned in close to the screen, and she could feel the change in him, the way a man changes when 20 years of wondering finally intersects with 20 years of answer. It was all there. Gerald Pruitt's corruption documented in exhaustive detail. Equipment sales, falsified reports, money transfers to offshore accounts. And beyond that, beyond the standard corruption that might have warranted a dishonorable discharge, and a few years in federal prison, there were the communications. Encrypted messages between Pruitt and someone identified only as contact. Discussions of convoy schedules, patrol routes, the specific vulnerabilities in base security that Pruitt had mapped and sold. And 3 weeks before the ambush, a message from Pruitt to contact. Problem with Guardian, knows too much, need permanent solution. Will provide updated convoy schedule for next week. Consider us even. Ruth read the words 3 times. Permanent solution. Her son had died because a man decided that a 25-year-old soldier knowing too much about his side operations was worth trading away. Had made that calculation and written it in a message and hit send, and then gone on with his life and had continued going on with his life for 20 years, while Danny lay in the ground on a 60-acre farm in Oklahoma. This is everything Colt said. His voice was controlled, but only barely. This is enough. With this, a federal investigation opens within 48 hours of being received. It's more than Pruitt Axe said, still staring at the screen. Look at the contractor names, the names in the offshore transfers. This is a network. Danny wasn't just documenting one corrupt sergeant. He was documenting an entire system. He knew what he had, Preacher said softly. That's why he hid it. That's why he called it insurance. Ruth closed the folder and looked at the drive in her hand. Such a small thing, such a long time waiting. We go to Nevada, she said. Her voice was steady. We take this evidence and we put it in front of Gerald Pruitt and we make him answer for what he did. Colt looked at her for a long moment. We finish the house first, he said. Get you settled. Make sure everything's in order. How long a week? Maybe less. He held her gaze. Then we ride to Nevada. Ruth nodded once. Around her, the Oklahoma night was full of the sounds of men sleeping and fires dying and the distant call of something wild in the fields beyond the fence line. Her new house stood half-built against the stars bones of fresh lumber, waiting to become walls, waiting to become the shape of a life that wasn't over yet. She thought about Danny building his case. Danny understanding what he'd found and what it meant in making the choice to document all of it instead of walking away from it. Danny writing a letter to his mother before he shipped out, knowing it might be the last thing he ever wrote her, and spending some of that letter on a phone number and a promise. Let the boys take care of you. She hadn't known what that meant when she first read it. She was beginning to understand. The house was finished on a Thursday. Ruth stood at the edge of her property and looked at what 312 men had built in 7 days, and she couldn't speak. It was a craftsman-style house with a wide front porch and fresh white paint and solar panels on the south-facing roof, and a garden already planted around the foundation, black-eyed Susans and Indian paintbrush, and the particular variety of climbing rose that had grown along the fence of her old house and that someone had taken cuttings from before the tornado could finish destroying them. Above the front door, a wooden plaque had been installed in dark oak, hand-carved with letters she could read from 20 feet away. Ruth Calloway, mother of the Hells Riders. She stood there for a long time. Colt appeared beside her. We leave tomorrow morning, he said. 20 bikes, me, Preacher, Axe, Connor, and 16 others who volunteered. We ride light and we ride fast. Ruth nodded. She had spent the 7 days of construction moving through the work the way she'd moved through difficult shifts in the ER, putting one foot in front of the other and letting the motion carry her forward when thinking too hard about the destination became counterproductive. She had accepted meals and conversation and an endless series of stories about Danny from men who had known him in the years she hadn't. She had watched her new house take shape board by board. She had read Danny's letter 6 more times and slept with it folded in her jacket pocket. She was ready. That night, she sat on the new porch in the dark and listened to the Oklahoma quiet, which was different from the Oklahoma quiet she'd known for 22 years. That quiet had been the quiet of absence, the quiet of a place where someone used to be. This quiet was just evening, just crickets and wind, and the distant sound of a truck on Route 44, the ordinary quiet of a world that was continuing without requiring anything particular from her, sir. She went to sleep at 9 o'clock and woke up at 5, and the 20 bikes were already lined up on the road. The ride to Nevada took 3 days. 3 days of Texas flatlands and New Mexico, high desert, and the long red rock corridors of Arizona, 3 days of truck stop coffee and motel rooms that smelled like industrial cleaning products, and the particular quality of silence that falls when 20 motorcycle engines stop simultaneously in a parking lot. Ruth rode behind Colt, her arms around his waist. The USB drive in the inside pocket of the jacket that one of the brothers had produced for her, black leather that was slightly too large in the shoulders and fit everywhere else as though it had been made for her. Connor rode 3 bikes back. On the second night at a diner outside Flagstaff where the coffee was genuinely good and the pie was the kind of pie that people in other parts of the country talk about when they describe what they miss about places they've left, he sat across from her in the booth and told her about his father. His father had come home from Vietnam in 1971 and never entirely come home from Vietnam in any other sense. Spent the next 30 years in a version of himself that the war had edited heavily, the important parts still present, but inaccessible like a book with the good chapters locked behind a door nobody had the key to. Died in 2003 without ever having talked to anyone about what had happened to him and over there without ever having asked for help from a system that had sent him and then forgotten to maintain him. Connor had joined the Hells Riders at 20 because there was nowhere else that felt like it might understand what he was carrying. Ruth listened to all of it. Then she reached across the table and took his hand, the way she'd taken his hand in the cellar during the tornado when he was hyperventilating against the back wall, and she'd pressed his palm to her sternum and told him to breathe with her. "You have a place now," she said. "That's not nothing. That's everything." He looked at her with his young man's eyes that had seen more than young men should have to see, and he nodded once and they finished their pie in the particular comfortable silence of people who have already said the important things. On the third morning they crossed into Nevada. The desert opened up around them in every direction, vast and flat, and the color of old bone under the hard southwestern sun. Ruth had never been to this part of the country, had never seen landscapes this stripped of the green she associated with living places, had never understood until now the particular beauty of a place that makes no effort to be welcoming. Nevada didn't care whether you found it beautiful. It was what it was, and you could take it or not. Henderson appeared on the horizon around 3 in the afternoon. A sprawl of subdivision housing and strip malls and the infrastructure of ordinary American life clustered at the edge of Las Vegas like an afterthought. Clean streets, watered lawns that had no business being green in this climate. The architecture of a place where people had chosen to make their lives in the middle of somewhere inhospitable and had replicated the familiar forms of somewhere else to make it feel like it wasn't. Colt pulled the formation into a gas station on the edge of town. 20 engines died at once. Ruth climbed off the bike and stretched the 3 days of road out of her back and stood in the parking lot of a gas station in Henderson, Nevada, with the USB drive in her pocket and 20 men in leather vests waiting for whatever came next. "How are you feeling?" Colt asked. "Like someone who has been on the back of a motorcycle for 3 days. She rotated her neck carefully, and like someone who is ready. He nodded. He checked something on his phone. 2847 Desert Rose Lane. About 10 minutes from here. 10 minutes. She had spent 20 years without knowing there was a name to attach to her son's death. She had spent 7 days knowing the name and not being able to use it. Now she was 10 minutes from using it. Colt gathered the group around him in the parking lot, 20 men in a loose circle, the ordinary citizens filling their gas tanks, giving them a wide berth with the instinctive caution that large groups of bikers tend to inspire in people who have not yet determined whether they need to be afraid. "We stay calm," Colt said. "We stay controlled. No matter what happens, no matter what he says or does, we don't give him anything he can use. We are not here to break the law. We are here to support Ruth." His eyes moved across the group and landed on each face briefly. "Understood." 20 men nodded. "What if he runs?" Axe asked. "He won't run." Colt was certain about this in the way he was certain about most things based on information and experience rather than hope. Men like Pruitt have built too much. House family reputation. He spent 20 years becoming Richard Haynes. He's not going to throw that away by bolting. He's going to try to manage this situation. And if he manages it by denying everything, Colt looked at Ruth. Then Ruth shows him what Danny left behind, he said. And after that, it's her call. Ruth appreciated that. It was her call. It had always been her call. These men had ridden across 3 states to make sure she got the chance to make it. But the making of it was hers, and they all understood that. They mounted up and rode the 10 minutes to Desert Rose Lane. The street was exactly what the name suggested it would be. Cookie-cutter houses in beige and tan, identical, except for the shutters and the mailboxes and the particular choices each household had made about front yard landscaping. American flags on some porches, basketball hoops over some garages, wind chimes on the porch of number 2847, which sat in the middle of the block with a red minivan in the driveway and a potted geranium by the front door, and the complete visual vocabulary of a home where nothing bad had ever happened. Colt pulled to the curb 3 houses down. The other bikes spread along the street, not clustering, not making a formation, just parking at intervals that were casual enough to seem incidental and deliberate enough to constitute a perimeter. Ruth noticed the deliberateness of it and said nothing. She climbed off the bike, her legs were steady, her hands were steady. Everything that had been shaking in her for 7 days had gone very still. In the last 10 minutes, the way things go still when the waiting is finally over. Preacher and Axe fell into step beside her. Colt followed 3 paces back. She walked to the door of 2847 Desert Rose Lane and climbed the 2 porch steps and raised her hand and knocked. Footsteps inside. The sound of a television being muted. A woman's voice calling something from another room. The door opened. Gerald Pruitt was shorter than she had imagined. She had built him up in her mind over 7 days of knowing his name, had given him a size that matched what he'd done, and the reality of him was a correction that required a moment to absorb. Average height, thinning gray hair, a face that was forgettable in the specific way that some faces are forgettable, because nothing in them is doing anything interesting. He was wearing khakis and a collared shirt and holding a can of beer. And he looked like someone's father, like anyone's neighbor, like the kind of man who shows up to the neighborhood association meeting and has opinions about parking. He looked at the 4 people on his porch with the expression of someone who has answered the door expecting a delivery. "Can I help you?" His voice was pleasant. Practice pleasant, the pleasantness of a man who has spent 20 years being careful but pleasant. "Gerald Pruitt," Ruth said. Something moved behind his eyes. Fast, controlled, but visible if you knew to look for it. "I think you have the wrong house." He said it easily, the ease of a prepared response. "My name is Richard Haynes. Your name is Gerald Pruitt." She said it without elevation, without performance, stating a fact the way you state facts. "You served in the United States Army from 1989 to 2005. You were assigned to FOB Cobra in Afghanistan in 2003 and 2004. You were a logistics sergeant. You controlled the convoy schedules and the supply routes." His hand tightened on the beer can. She could see the knuckles change color. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "I think you need to leave. You knew my son." Ruth took 1 step forward. "Specialist Daniel Calloway, road name guardian. He found out what you were doing, and he started building a case against you, and 3 weeks later, you sold his convoy route to the enemy, and he died in an ambush that killed 9 other people and saved 12 more, because he was the kind of man you will never be." The beer can slipped from his hand. It hit the porch boards and foam spilled across the wood, and he didn't look down at it. He was staring at her with a face that had gone the color of old concrete, the particular gray of a man whose entire internal structure is failing at once. "I don't," he said. "I don't know anyone by that name." Ruth reached into her jacket and produced the photograph. Danny's army portrait, the one from the funeral program, the one she had carried in her wallet for 20 years. She held it up in front of his face. This was my son. She kept her voice level. He was 25 years old. He had 30 years of life ahead of him. He had a mother who needed him and brothers who loved him and a gift for taking care of people that the world was worse off losing. And you traded him for money. This is insane. Pruitt's voice rose. He turned his head toward the interior of the house. Sarah called the police. A woman appeared in the hallway behind him. Blonde mid-40s wearing the expression of someone who has come to investigate a minor disruption and discovered something considerably more significant. Her eyes moved from her husband's face to the four people on the porch and back again. Richard, what's happening? Who are these people? It's nothing. His voice was trying for reassurance and not reaching it. Go back inside. Just a misunderstanding. It is not a misunderstanding. Ruth stepped forward again, close enough now that she could see the individual lines of strain around Pruitt's eyes, the tremor in his jaw. You sold convoy information to the enemy. You did it to protect a corruption operation that had been running for years. And when my son found out and told you he was going to report it, you decided the easiest solution was to have him killed. That is a lie. The words came out as a hiss. Ruth reached into her pocket and produced the USB drive. She held it up between them. Pruitt's face, which had been gray, went to something beyond gray, a color she had no name for. The color of a man watching 20 years of safety disappear. Do you know what this is? She asked. He didn't answer. Danny was smarter than you gave him credit for. He documented everything. Every transaction, every account, every communication between you and your contact overseas, every falsified report, every sale. Ruth let him look at the drive for another moment, and he made a copy that you didn't know about. He hid it before he shipped out. I found it last week. That's not possible. Pruitt's voice had gone hollow. His evidence was destroyed. I made certain of it. You made certain of the copies he kept on the base. Ruth felt something crystallize inside her, cold and clear. But Danny came home 3 weeks before that last deployment and hollowed out his family Bible and put this inside it. Because he knew you'd found out that he was building a case. Because he knew what that probably meant. And because he was the kind of person who, even when he was afraid, was thinking about what happened after. Richard. His wife's voice from behind him had changed entirely. The ordinary concern was gone. In its place was something that had looked at his face and understood that this was not a misunderstanding. Richard, what is she talking about? What evidence? Pruitt didn't answer her. He was still looking at the USB drive. Around them, the street had acquired an audience. Curtains were moving in windows. A neighbor across the street had stopped pretending to check his mailbox. 2 doors down, a woman had come out onto her porch with a phone in her hand. Tell her, Ruth said quietly. Pruitt looked at his wife, then at the gathering neighbors, then at Colton Axe and Preacher standing behind Ruth on his front walk, then back at Ruth. Something in him shifted. She saw it happen. Something that had been held together by 20 years of careful living and deliberate forgetting came apart in the span of 3 seconds, and what was left underneath it was a man who was exhausted. A man who had been tired for a very long time of being someone who had done what he'd done. He stepped to the edge of his porch. He didn't speak for a moment. When he did, his voice had lost all its practiced pleasantness. I was running equipment sales on the side, he said, for years, skimming from supply requisitions, selling to contractors who didn't ask questions. It was money. Just money. He said it like money was a self-evident explanation for anything. Your son found the discrepancies in the inventory reports. He was meticulous, more meticulous than anyone I'd encountered in 15 years of doing it. A phone appeared in someone's hand across the street, then another. He confronted me about it, Pruitt continued. Said he was going to take it to the Inspector General. I told him nobody would believe him. He said he had documentation. He said he'd been collecting it for 2 months. Sarah had moved to the doorway. She was gripping the doorframe with both hands. I panicked, Pruitt said. I had contacts overseas, people I'd been selling information to on the side. Route information, timing, that kind of thing. Small things. I told myself they were small things. He looked at his hands. I contacted them. I told them about the convoy. I told them I needed the problem resolved. What did you think resolved meant? Ruth asked. I thought. He stopped. His jaw worked. I told them I needed him detained, captured, held long enough for me to destroy the evidence on his end and get ahead of the situation. I told them it was supposed to be a kidnapping, but it wasn't. No, his voice had dropped to something barely audible. It wasn't. They ambushed the convoy, multiple vehicles. Your son got out of his burning vehicle, and instead of taking cover, he went toward them. He was drawing their fire. He saved people in that convoy. He saved 12 people. Pruitt's eyes were wet. I didn't order that. I didn't want that. But I made it possible. Ruth stood very still. This was the moment she had driven 3 days across 2 deserts to reach. And now that she was inside it, she understood something she hadn't expected to understand. She had come here wanting to seek guilt, and she had found it full and genuine and absolutely useless because guilt in the man who killed your son does not give you your son back. It doesn't return a single day of the 20 years you spent not knowing. It doesn't fill anything. It just confirms the shape of the whole. I never meant for anyone to die, Pruitt said. I know you didn't, Ruth said. That's almost worse. Her voice was steady. You made a calculation. You decided that protecting your side operation was worth trading my son's life as a bargaining chip. You didn't intend the outcome, but you set it in motion. You provided the information. You made the call. And then you built a new name and a new life, and you've been living with that for 20 years while Danny's been in the ground. Pruitt's knees buckled slightly. He grabbed the porch railing. His wife said, Richard. Her voice was very small. She had understood enough of what she was hearing to understand all of it. I didn't know how to he started. I know how it works, Ruth said. She had spent 35 years watching people manage the things they'd done and couldn't undo. You didn't know how to be the person who did this, so you became someone else. And that worked for 20 years. She looked at him steadily. It stops working today. A siren sounded in the distance, getting closer. Pruitt's wife had gone back inside. Not to call the police, Ruth had suspected, or not only for that. She had gone inside because the person she'd been standing next to for 15 years of marriage had just become a stranger on his own front porch, and she needed a wall between herself and that fact. I'm sorry, Pruitt said. He was looking at Ruth, and the words seemed genuine and entirely inadequate in equal measure. I am sorry. For what it's worth. It isn't worth anything, Ruth said, but I needed you to say it. I needed to hear you say it out loud in front of witnesses. She looked at him for a moment longer. My son spent the last month of his life building a case against you because he believed that what was right was worth whatever it cost him. He was correct about that. He was correct about most things. The siren grew into 2 sirens and then 3. 3 Henderson police cruisers turned onto Desert Rose Lane. They pulled up in front of the house with their lights going, and officers stepped out with a careful assessment of people arriving at a situation they haven't fully characterized yet. What's going on here? The lead officer called out. Before Ruth could answer, a 4th vehicle turned onto the street. Not a police cruiser, a black sedan with government plates that she recognized from enough television news coverage to understand what government plates on a black sedan generally meant in situations like this one. The man who stepped out of it was in his late 50s, gray-haired and straight-backed in the way that military service instills and never entirely lets go of. He was wearing civilian clothes, but his bearing made the clothes irrelevant. He walked past the police officers without acknowledging them and passed Colt and Axe and Preacher and stopped in front of Ruth. Mrs. Calloway. His voice was formal and direct. I'm Colonel Marcus Webb, retired. Army Criminal Investigation Division, 22 years. I've been following the Pruitt case since 2004. Ruth looked at him. I was assigned to investigate the ambush, he said. I found evidence of a leak within 3 months. Found Pruitt's name within 6 months. He glanced at Pruitt, who was still holding the porch railing. Every time I got close, the evidence chain broke. Witnesses stopped cooperating. Documents went missing. He looked back at Ruth. The Army doesn't publicize its failures, especially not the ones that involve selling American soldiers to the enemy. How did you know I was here? We've been monitoring Pruitt's address since your name appeared in the news coverage from Creek County. He said it matter-of-factly. When a group of motorcycles left Oklahoma 3 days ago, we had a reasonable hypothesis about the destination. Ruth reached into her pocket and held out the USB drive. Webb took it with both hands carefully, the way you take something you have been waiting for long enough that receiving it requires a moment of adjustment. My son built that case, she said. He documented everything. Not just Pruitt's corruption, the network, the contractors, the contacts, the money trail, all of it. Webb looked at the drive. His expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, a controlled release of 20 years of frustrated effort. Your son was an exceptional soldier, Mrs. Calloway, he said, and an exceptional investigator. With this, we can do what I couldn't do 20 years ago. He turned to the police officers. Take Gerald Pruitt into custody. The charge is conspiracy to commit murder in the death of United States Army Specialist Daniel Calloway. Additional charges will follow from the federal level within 24 hours. The officers moved forward. Pruitt looked at Ruth one more time as they came up the porch steps. He was shaking. The beer can was still on the boards where it had fallen, the foam long since dried to a pale residue in the Nevada afternoon sun. I'm sorry, he said again. Ruth met his eyes. She thought about Danny in the burning vehicle. She thought about the choice he'd made to go toward the fire instead of away from it. She thought about 12 men who had come home because her son had made that choice, 12 families who had not had uniformed men come to their doors, 12 lives that continued because Daniel Calloway had understood in his final minutes what it meant to put yourself between danger and the people who needed protecting. She thought about what it meant that she was standing here now, that she had found the drive, that the case Danny had built with his own hands was going to do what he'd intended it to do 20 years late, but doing it. It won't bring him back, she said. That's what I know. She looked at Pruitt without anger, which surprised her because she had expected anger and found instead something quieter and more settled. But Danny built that case because he believed the truth was worth protecting, even when it cost everything. I'm going to make sure the world knows he was right about that. They put Pruitt in the back of a cruiser. The door closed. The engine started. Ruth watched the cruiser move down Desert Rose Lane and turn at the corner and disappear, and the street went quiet around her except for the murmur of the gathered neighbors and the sound of wind moving through the desert landscaping that lined every yard on the block. Colt appeared beside her. You okay? She considered the question honestly. I thought I'd feel different, she said. I thought there'd be something, some release, some sense of the weight lifting. What do you feel? She looked at the empty street where the police cruiser had been. I feel like my son is still gone, she said. And I feel like what he did matters. And I feel like those two things are going to have to be enough because that's what's true. Colt was quiet for a moment. Justice doesn't fill the hole grief leaves, he said. It just stops it from getting bigger. Ruth looked at him. She had heard him say a great many things over the past 2 weeks, and most of them had been correct, and this one was the most correct of all. Let's go home, she said. Yes, ma'am, said Colt. The ride back to Oklahoma took 4 days. 4 days of Nevada desert, in Arizona Red Rock, and New Mexico high country, and the long return across Texas, and Ruth sat behind Colt and watched America pass on either side of her and thought about Danny and thought about Frank and thought about 60 acres of red clay that had belonged to her family for 3 generations and that she was going home to. Colonel Webb called on the second day. The USB drive was beyond what they'd hoped for, he said. Not just Pruitt. The contractor network, the payment chains, the contacts. 17 individuals currently under federal investigation. The case was going to take years to fully prosecute, but it was going to happen. It was finally going to happen. Danny did this, Ruth said. Yes, ma'am, Webb said. Your son took down a corruption network that had been operating for a decade. He just needed someone to deliver the evidence. She rode the rest of that day without speaking much, which Colt seemed to understand required no accommodation other than the road and the miles and the sound of the engine. The Washington Post called on the third day. A journalist named Catherine Doyle had gotten the story from Henderson's sources and wanted Ruth's account. Ruth agreed. The article ran before they crossed back into Oklahoma, and by the time they reached Creek County, Danny's photograph was on the front pages of papers she'd never read in cities she'd never visited. The story spread the way. Stories spread when they contain all the elements that stories need. A young man who chose to do right when doing right was dangerous. A system that had failed him. A mother who had spent 20 years not knowing the truth, and a truth that was exactly as significant as the person who died protecting it. Danny became a name people knew. Guardian became a word people understood. Ruth Calloway became something she hadn't anticipated and couldn't entirely process, a symbol of something that resonated beyond her specific story, The particular American image of a person who refused to accept that 20 years of injustice was the final word on what her son's life meant. She didn't feel like a symbol. She felt tired and road sore and ready to be home. They arrived on a Saturday afternoon. Ruth climbed off Colt's bike in her own driveway and stood in front of her new house and looked at the plaque above the door and the rose garden around the foundation and the 79 rose bushes that had been planted in the field to the side of the house while they were gone, one for each person she'd sheltered from the tornado. She looked at the stone marker in the center of the rose garden. Daniel Guardian Calloway, son, soldier, brother, forever remembered. That evening, the field behind the house filled with people. Not 312, not this time, but enough. The men who'd stayed nearby, the chapter members from Oklahoma and Texas and Kansas, who had come back to be present for whatever came next. Torches had been placed in a large circle in the field. Folding tables appeared from somewhere. The smell of cooking rose into the cooling evening air. Colt stood on a platform that had been constructed from lumber left over from the house. He didn't use a microphone. He didn't need one. Brothers, he said, and the field went quiet with the immediate quality of silence that falls when the right person speaks. We are here tonight to do something that has never been done in the history of this club. Ruth stood beside him. 20 years ago, he continued, a man named Danny Calloway joined our family. Road name Guardian. He was 20 years old and in trouble, and we helped him, and he stayed not because he owed us, but because he found something here that he'd been looking for. He was one of the best men any of us ever knew. Murmurs of agreement from around the circle. Danny asked us to protect his mother. He made that request before his last deployment, and he trusted us to honor it. Colt's voice was steady but not easy. We failed that promise. For 20 years, Ruth Calloway was alone on this property. She lost her husband and her son and her home, and we weren't there. The field was very quiet. But 2 weeks ago, a tornado brought 79 of our brothers to her door. And instead of locking herself inside and waiting for it to pass, she ran toward them. She ran through the rain in the middle of an EF4 tornado, and she offered everything she had to people she'd never met. She saved 79 lives. She held a man's broken arm together with her bare hands in a concrete cellar while a tornado tore her house apart above her. She talked a 22-year-old kid through the worst night of his life. Connor, standing at the edge of the circle, looked at the ground. She rode across 3 states to look the man who killed her son directly in the face. She delivered the evidence her son died building. She got him the justice he earned. Colt turned to face Ruth directly, and through all of it, she never once asked for anything in return. He reached into his vest and produced a small piece of leather. The death's head emblem, the club's symbol, but surrounded by a border of gold that she had not seen on any other patch. Below the emblem, a single word stitched in the same gold thread. Mother. This patch, Colt said, has never been given to anyone outside this club. Not once in the history of the Hells Riders. Tonight, by unanimous vote of every chapter president in 18 states, that changes. He held the patch up so the torchlight caught the gold. From this night forward, Ruth Calloway belongs to this family. Not as a guest, not as an honorary member, as family. When she needs something, we answer. When she calls, we come. When someone threatens what's hers, they're threatening what's ours. He looked at Ruth. That is what this means. Do you accept it? Ruth looked out at the circle of faces in the torchlight. Men she'd known for 2 weeks. Men she'd known for 2 days. Men she'd never met, who had driven or ridden from wherever they were when the call went out. She saw Connor near the back with his young man's eyes. She saw Axe with his scarred face and his 20 years of trying. She saw a preacher with his kind eyes and his limp. She saw the faces of men who had sat with her and told her about her son, given her the Danny she hadn't known, made her loss larger and more bearable simultaneously. I accept, she said. The field erupted. The sound of it went up into the Oklahoma night and scattered the stars and came back down, changed into something that wasn't just sound anymore. It was declaration. It was welcome. It was the audible shape of a promise being kept. Colt pinned the patch to her jacket over her heart. Welcome home, he said. The celebration lasted until well past midnight. Food and music and an endless circulation of men with stories about Danny, each one a piece of him she hadn't had before, each one filling in a section of the map of his life that she'd been navigating without knowing how incomplete it was. She accepted all of it. She held it carefully. Around 11, she slipped away from the noise. She walked to the rose garden beside the house and stood in front of the stone marker and looked at her son's name in the dark. The sounds of the gathering reached her, softly reduced by distance to something that sounded like warmth, like the sound a room full of people you love makes when you're standing just outside of it. "Hi, baby," she said. The Oklahoma night settled around her. Insects, a wind moving through the new rose bushes, the distant murmur of voices she was beginning to know. "I know you've been watching." She smiled at the stone. "I know you've probably been watching this whole time, probably laughing at your stubborn old mother getting herself into trouble with a bunch of bikers in the middle of a tornado." She paused. "I understand now why you didn't tell me. I don't agree with it, but I understand it. You were 20 years old and you'd made a mess of things, and I was the person you were most afraid to disappoint. I would have told you that was impossible. I would have been right, but I understand why you didn't believe me." She touched the stone. "They kept the promise," she said. 20 years late, but they kept it. I have a new house and 300 sons and more stories about you than I can hold in my head at once. And the man who killed you is going to answer for it in a federal courtroom. And the case you built is bringing down people he was connected to that you might not have even known about. You did more than you knew, Danny. You usually did." She pressed her fingers to the stone for a moment. "Rest now," she said. "You've done everything you came here to do. I'll be okay. I've got people looking out for me now." She looked up at the stars. "I think you probably knew that was going to happen. I think you knew exactly what you were doing when you made them promise." The wind moved through the rose bushes. She stayed there for a long time. When she finally walked back toward the light, in the voices she felt something that she didn't have a single word for. A composite feeling loss and gratitude, and the particular quality of peace that comes not from the absence of grief, but from grief finally finding its proper shape and settling into it. The grief wasn't gone. It would never be gone. But it had stopped being the only thing. Stone found her on the new porch at dawn. She was sitting with a cup of coffee, watching the eastern horizon go from dark to gray to the first pale suggestion of gold. The construction smell of the new house was still present in the morning air, fresh lumber and paint, and the particular newness of something that hasn't yet accumulated the history that makes a place feel inhabited. "You should have slept," he said. She made room on the porch steps and he sat down beside her. "What do you want to do now?" he asked. She held her coffee and thought about it honestly. For 22 years, she had survived, had existed in the particular suspended state of a person who has lost the things that gave daily life its forward motion and hasn't found replacements. She had endured. She had counted dollars and days and seconds between siren wails. She had been the calm in other people's storms and then gone home to 60 acres of silence and done it again the next day. "I want to help people," she said, "the way Caleb did, the way you all do." She looked out at the field where the last of the torches had burned down to cold metal. Veterans who came home and couldn't find their way back to anything. Families who lost someone in the war and never got the truth about how or why. People who are alone because nobody told them there was a family waiting. Colt was quiet for a moment. "We could set up a foundation," he said. "Use the club's resources, the connections. We have people in every state, people who know how to find people who've fallen through cracks." "The Danny Calloway Foundation," Ruth said. He would have liked that. She looked at the rose garden where the stone marker stood, and at the house behind her that smelled like new wood and possibility, and at the road that had brought her to this particular morning after a very long time of mornings that didn't have this quality of openness to them. Connor appeared at the edge of the porch. He was holding a cup of coffee and had the look of someone who had also not slept and had made his peace with that. He looked at Ruth and Colt and said, "I want to be part of it." The foundation. My dad's story isn't the only one like his. I know a dozen like it from this club alone. People who needed help they never got, and families who needed answers they never received. Ruth looked at him. He was 22 years old and he had his father's war inside him and his own particular grief. And he was standing on her porch in the early morning offering to make himself useful, which was the most Danny thing anyone could have done in this moment. "Then you're the first one on the list," she said. He nodded once and sat down on the porch steps, and the three of them watched the sun come up over Oklahoma. Together, the light moving across the field, and the rose garden, and the stone, and the new house, in the particular way that light moves across land that has been through something and is still standing. Colt stayed until mid-morning. He had chapter business in Tulsa, he said, but he'd be back by the end of the week. He stood at his bike and looked at her with those January river eyes that had, over the course of 2 weeks, lost most of their coldness without losing any of their steadiness. "You sure you're all right here alone?" "I've been alone for 22 years, she said. "I think I can manage a few days." "That's not what I meant." "I know." She reached out and held his hand for a moment. "I'll be fine, Colt. Better than fine." He pulled her into a hug that lifted her slightly off the ground, which she allowed because it was the kind of hug that needed to be completed. "Take care of yourself," he said. "You too." He mounted the bike and kicked it to life, and the engine sound filled the morning, and he raised one hand and rode down the road until the sound faded into the ordinary sounds of the Oklahoma day. Ruth stood in her driveway and listened to the silence after. It was different from the silence she had known for 22 years. That silence had been defined by what was absent from it. This one was just silence, the quiet of a morning that was available for whatever came next. Not demanding anything, not keeping score, just present. She went inside and set her coffee cup in the sink of her new kitchen and stood at the window that looked out over the rose garden and the field and the road that went east toward town and west toward whatever was left of Route 44, stretching out toward the horizon. She had opened her cellar to 79 strangers and gained 300 sons. She had gone looking for the truth about her son's death and found a family she hadn't known existed. She had lost everything and found that everything she needed had been on this land all along, waiting for the right storm to shake it loose. Outside, the Oklahoma sun was climbing. The rose bushes were catching the light. The stone marker stood in the center of the garden, and her son's name was carved into it in letters she could read from the kitchen window, and she could stand there and read them whenever she wanted, which was not the same as having him. Not remotely the same, but was something. It was something. She looked up at the sky above the garden, blue and clean and enormous, in the way Oklahoma skies are enormous when nothing is standing in the way of how far you can see. "I did it," she said quietly. The morning was warm around her. The wind moved through the roses. She had spent 22 years in the darkness of a particular kind of grief, and she had learned to function in it and even to find meaning in it, but she had not known until this morning what it felt like to stand on the other side of it. Now she knew. She picked up her coffee cup and walked out to the porch and sat down in the chair that faced east, and she watched the light strengthen across the land that had belonged to her family for 3 generations and that she was not going to sell to anyone for any price. And she thought about what came next, which was a thing she had not permitted herself to think about for a very long time. What came next was a foundation with her son's name on it. What came next was Connor and his father's story and the dozen stories like it. What came next was 300 people who would answer when she called. What came next was everything.